and it has inspired a whole range of political involvements, from a peaceful activism focusing on constitutional change and human rights to a violent radicalism which entirely rejects the state. Now, this presentation shall focus on the presence of Islamist group Ansar al Sunna in Kwale County in Kenya, and account for its association with incidents of extremist violence. Now, I base this discussion on ethnographic fieldwork centered on the founder of the Ansar al Sunna group, an individual, Sheikh Rimo, and then try to describe how Salafist mentality gets entangled in efforts to preach and practice purist Islam and a desire to address the mundane everyday lives of Muslims in Kenya and Kwale who claim to be excluded and marginalized by the state. Now in Kenya, claims of marginalization by Muslims has to do with the identification of the state with Christianity, particularly the Christianity which is increasingly Pentecostal and often overtly hostile to Islam. The suspicion that in the larger Kenya, Christians receive favored treatment from state merges with localized resentments in Kwale against people who have moved to the coast from other parts of Kenya, many of whom are Christians. So this is both the national contextualization of Ansar al Sunna as well as the local contextualization, but broadly it is understood in terms of how they view how the state marginalizes them. And then for many Kenyans, including many at the coast and Islam are somehow synonymous. Islam has a long history at the coast because we have archaeological remains and the current architecture and public culture of most shoreline towns reveal the powerful presence of Islam as a daily part of many people's lives over more than 1,000 years. However, in terms of population, the 6 counties of the coast are by no means overwhelmingly Muslim. We know that census figures do not particularly categorize populations on religious lines, but we are told that the population of Muslim is about 11% in Kenya. Nevertheless, in reference to the coast, there is always this tendency to say that coast is largely Muslim, if not overwhelmingly Muslim. And this claim that the coast is largely Muslim situates a group like Ansar al Sunna when it emerges and addresses issues of marginalization or issues of relations between Muslims and the state, then it is normally viewed as an Islamic group that has an ideology of extremism, of an ideology of Islamists. But to a certain extent, we probably want to think that the issues that groups like Ansar al Sunna raise have more to do with how citizens of a country address their relationship with the state. If we remove the tag of Ansar al Sunna because they are Muslims and we think more about the issues that they are addressing, you find that these are issues that could be addressed by any other resident or any other citizen, and they would be addressed as civic issues that citizens are addressing and wanting the state to address them. But there is this notion that because the coast is Islam and because the larger nation is Christian, then an Islamic group will always be opposed to Christianity. So this, at the backdrop of claims of marginalization of Muslims, is a history of irredentism, a campaign of secession that flourished briefly on the coast just before Kenya's independence in the early 1980s. This has been revived in the early 21st century in the context of debates over Kenya's constitution. Again, there is a history of irredentism in the coast and also in other parts of northern Kenya. And to understand Ansar al Sunna, one needs to also understand the context in which the ideas of re-identism continuously emerge and keep on re-emerging in the coast, because the campaign of secession has been driven by fears of political and economic domination by people from other parts of Kenya. But it was partly predicated on a historical distinction. Now, the initial establishment of British authority at the coast in the 1880s had rested on legal basis of a 1986 Anglo-German treaty, and which had declared a 10-mile strip as this part of the Sultanate of Zanzibar. Now, the Sultan leased this to the British East African Company in around 1887. But in 1895, the British government took direct control of the strip as part of the larger British East African Protectorate. But in 1920, the rest of the protectorate became Kenya colony. The stripe remained formally the territory of the Sultan, hence the title Colony and Protectorate of Kenya. So it was that at independence, as independence neared in the early 1960s, some argued that the coast, or Mwambao, as they called it, should either be returned to Zanzibar rule or become independent by itself. Now, these arguments were echoed some 50 years later by supporters of a nebulous Mombasa Republican Council, which again called for independence for the coast. Now, these issues of secession and irredentism, they are very, very central in understanding the emergence of Ansar al Sunna, because in their discourse or in their Islamist discourse, the Ansar al Sunna also, or somehow they're enjoined within the broader discourse of the coast wanting to be separate from Kenya, because in their view, Kenya is basically a Christian nation, and as Muslims, they feel that they are out of place. So, as Ansar al Sunna exists, also there are other groups that exist, like the Mombasa Republican Council, which kind of fuels the fire that enables a group like Ansar al Sunna to continue articulate the discourse of marginalization, but within the space and sphere of Islam, or within the space and sphere of Islamic ideologies. But in actual sense, removing the tag of Islam, you find that Ansar al Sunna basically addresses itself to the same questions that MRC will be addressing, or they'll be addressing themselves to the same questions that any other civic society group will be addressing, the questions of marginalization, questions of rights of citizens. It so happens that the origin of Ansar al Sunna has its foundation in a religious ideology. So what is the genesis of Ansar al Sunna in Kwale? It has been argued that the evolution of jihadi thought, because there is an association of Ansar Sunna with the ideas of jihad. So the evolution of this jihadi thought is traced to Sheikh Abdulaziz Rimo, that he was the forebearer of this jihadi thinking or jihadi ideology in Kenya. But let us contextualize who Rimo is. Rimo was born in Kwale in late 1940. He was the son of an influential elder and the half-brother of a local administrator. Rimo comes from a respected family. He spent most of the 1970s studying on a scholarship in the Islamic University of Medina in Saudi Arabia. When Rimo returned to Kenya, this is around the 1980s, and this is a very common phenomenon of Muslim ulamas who are trained in Saudi Arabia returning back home around the 1980s, and they begin to engage in teaching and particularly engaging in dawah or propagation of Islam. And Rimo did this from amongst his own Digo people who live in the south coast of Kenya. He also engaged in discussing ideas of reform and renewal, or Islah and Tajdid, which involved denouncing those who have moved away from what he considered as proper Islam, and advising his followers against traditional ulama, or most traditional teachers, and urging them to avoid folk Islam, because within the coast or within Kwale, folk Islam is a very common practice. So Rimo felt that this was not the right way to practice Islam, and usually he advised his followers that folk Islam was not the right way to go. Rimo initially preached at his local mosque in his local village in Ukunda at Magutu, and this mosque was closely associated with his family. And here he attracted a significant following. And again, because the region or the area that Abdulaziz Rimo preached is now considered one of the strongest area where the Ansar al Sunna exists. The mosques around the area of Ukunda and basically the sub-county of Bongwe and Ukunda, this is where there is a very large concentration of followers of the Ansar al Sunna. So the mosque in which Rimo preached is closely associated with his family. And here he attracted a significant following due to his popularity. Soon the facility could not contain the sheer numbers who came to listen to his lectures. While Digirika, the mosque that he started preaching, was important within Magutu, it was not centrally located. And here we find that gradually Rimo moves to a central mosque nearby, which could accommodate many more people, but it was also centrally located. And his followers sought to spread the message to other areas and expanded from Digirika to Masjid Nuru and to another sub-county, particularly in Tiwi, amongst others. While at the central mosque, Rimo attracted worshippers from as far as Mombasa to the north and Msambweni to the south. And it is during this time that Nuru Mosque developed the status of a central Friday mosque and began to rival the larger Markaz Diani, another larger mosque within the vicinity. And Rimo started to deliver his most fiery sermons and began to attract the attention of the authorities. Now, I think, again, to understand Ansar al Sunna through Rimo is to contextualize what Rimo used to say during this period. And Rimo, he did not, for example, preach any violence. Rather, he articulated the grievances by Muslims against the state. And when he attracted the attention of the state, it was around the same time that other civic society organizations were challenging the authority of the presidency. They were also challenging the political arrangement in Kenya that basically was a one-party state. And so the clamor for the changes in the constitution, the removing of Section 2A in the Kenyan constitution to allow multi-party politics. This was at the same time that Rimo was preaching at the Nuru Mosque.
Mr. Makimako, you have 1 minute left. Sorry.
Okay. So in so doing, Rimo he advocated reformist Wahhabi Salafist agenda, and his discourse was anchored in the dichotomy between pure and impure. It is this discourse that a decade later gets entangled with violent extremism. It is the followers who, a decade later, listened to Rimo's preaching that became attracted to the idea that as Muslim people, they can not only preach, but they can take action, and that action meant that they need now to engage in activities that would address in a different manner mostly in a violent manner, their marginalization. It is around this time that people who had initially been influenced by Rimo in Mombasa began to trek back to Kwale and engage in recruiting young people to go to Somali. And it is in Somali that these young people were trained in the real extremist ideologies. And it is upon their return that now we see or we witness these violent extremist activities in Kwale, in the coast of Kenya. Thank you very much. I didn't have time to discuss the methodology, but maybe this will come in the question time. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And so much to know and understand about what is happening in the coast. So without further ado, I'd like to call upon Christopher to give his remarks, please.
Good morning, everybody. I think Professor Makimaka has provided a really useful political and historical context to what we've produced in this paper and what we've written about the current situation and the current violence ongoing. He's also addressed a lot of the issues of identity, which are fundamental to understanding the sort of the current network in the county. Sporadic violence in Kwale is often interpreted as a multifaceted battle between law enforcement, moderate clerics, and al-Shabaab loyalists, and this three-way battle has been sort of ongoing for the last decade or so. The media often labels the assailants targeted by police as al-Shabaab or purely as returnees from Somalia. Our paper explores these assumptions through the lens of Ansar al Sunna and provides a much more local perspective on violence in the area. Professor Makimako's interviews in Akunda and the surrounding area suggest that the allegiances and identities of those involved, and we can understand how from what he's already said, involved in Kwale's violence are much less straightforward than perhaps is often suggested. We should note that there are other strict Salafist communities also in Kwale. There's groups towards the Tanzanian border, for example. And we should also note that our paper doesn't simply review the drivers of violent extremism in Kwale County. It looks at violence within the county and not explicitly at those who have perhaps left to travel to Somalia, although obviously these two matters are inextricably linked. Ultimately, we sought to answer three questions. Who are Ansar al Sunna, which is something that I think Professor Makimako has explained in quite a lot of detail already. Secondly, why and how have they turned to violence? And who amongst them have turned to violence? And thirdly, how do they fit in within the context of more broader regional Islamist groups and sort of groups with more an internationalist outlook? So I'm going to try in my 9 minutes to provide a 2-minute answer to each of these questions and then highlight some key themes to take away. So the first question of who are Ansar al Sunna? It's not necessarily a formal organization as such. This is a group that could perhaps be interpreted by some as a sect or a movement. And obviously Ansar al Sunna groups exist in other parts of the world. The phrase simply means followers of the Sunnah or the Prophet's actions and teachings. In the context of Kwale, we're using the phrase really to refer to anyone who's an adherent of Sheikh Rimo's teachings. And as Professor Makimako said, Hassan Nzovu has said that most jihadi thought in Kenya can be traced back to Sheikh Rimo. And certainly he introduces takfiri thought to those on the South Coast. His following, once he came out of prison in the mid-90s, grew quite rapidly, although he and his followers turned to sort of a bonded community and isolated themselves from the modern state. But at this time, he attracted the likes of Sheikh Abu Rogo from Mombasa and Sheikh Salim Khan. His followers at this time also began to turn to sort of more forceful tactics, taking over other mosques. And after Rimo died in 2015, his adherents have continued to pursue his vision. I think the important thing to note is that most of these adherents to Rimo's followings are an assortment of individuals who identify as Ansar al Sunna purely through their religious practices. There's no sort of formal membership as such, as may be the case with some other DE organizations. And it really is critical, as Professor Makimako said, that Rimo did not advocate violence himself. Obviously, his successors and the likes of Rogo, Makaburi, and Khan all very much did so. But we're not interested necessarily here in those figures. We're interested in the more localized individuals around Ukunda, and especially in Bongwe, which is sort of a village to the just inland of Ukunda. So with that understanding of who they are, we turn to the second question: why and how have Ansar al Sunna turned to violence? Oh, and is it a sort of ubiquitous factor across Ansar al Sunna, which will obviously show is not the case. Some members have come into conflict with law enforcement agencies and those that challenge their religious sensibilities as a means to, quote, sort of protect the faith. In particular, Professor Maki Marco identified a group which is referred to as the Ansar Sugu within Ansar al Sunna. This group is identified as those most likely to use violence today. And recent murders that have made the international, or sorry, at least the national press in the Bongwe area targeting quote, moderate clerics, can be linked to this group. Community leaders and imams have been targeted. And we also found, Professor Maki Marco also found that letters are sent to the targets in advance. So those accused of collaborating with the police might be targeted and they'll be sent a warning letter that they're on the list to be targeted. Those practicing witchcraft similarly, and anyone really speaking out against the Ansar. So why have some members within this group turned to violence? Obviously, we first look at the broad structural grievances. And I think we've heard a lot about the sort of historic marginalization of the coast and Islam. Rimo appealed to the disenfranchised at the coast and connected Digo grievances to national politics, which hadn't really been done in such a formal way before, especially linked with Islam and the practice of Islam. Secondly, the breakdown in the relationship between youths and community elders has been written about in Kwale. And thirdly, and undoubtedly most importantly, extrajudicial violence and the strained relationship between the police and communities in Kwale has definitely worsened over the last decade. The police are often accused in the media as well of harassing moderates and assassinating those who have more radical inclinations. Of course, structural drivers alone cannot explain participation in violence. We must also consider individual incentives, so the perceived protection provided by group membership, sense of purpose, and perhaps a personal need for revenge, as well as enabling factors. So technology has provided greater awareness of international messaging around the subjugation of Islam, the historic weaknesses in law enforcement in the area, and other historic challenges in law enforcement in Kwale. And then Rimo himself as an enabling factor of what Khalil et al. Referred to as an ideological lens through which to interpret grievances. So individuals are able to see their daily quotidian experiences of security force discrimination, inequality, and injustice as evidence of the global subjugation of Islam. And finally, we must consider the group factors, so peer pressure, the threat of takfir, the normalization of violence. But obviously, even with this sort of four-level understanding of drivers, we need to understand why some have turned to violence and not others. And to do so, we need to consider both attitudes and behaviors. So it's critical we recognize that not all are involved, not all involved with Ansar al Sunna will turn to violence, and not all who do turn to violence will turn to violence for the same reasons and at the same time. The drivers, structural, enabling, individual, and group all combine in different ways and at different times for different people. So the third question we wanted to address was how does Ansar al Sunna relate to regional groups and better known movements across Eastern Africa in the Horn? As Professor Maki Marco said, there is an overlap in membership to a degree with Mombasa Republican Council, which is obviously an overtly political secessionist organization. The agendas of the two groups are blurred by their adoption of a coastarian identity, at least within Kwale, and in their opposition to a common enemy, the national government or the state. There are no formal links as such, but the overlap in membership certainly suggests that for some, and this is a point Professor Maki Marco made very clearly, it is marginalization that is critical. not necessarily the Salafist ideology. There are inextricable links, as we've seen, between Islamic and Coastarian identities. We found that the two groups have different relationship with Islam. So for the Ansar, Islam is very much fundamental to the very being and the existence of the movement, whereas for the MRC, it's more of a matter of convenience. Moving away from Kwale to Al-Shabaab, we also found that some members of the group could conceivably be associated with Al-Shabaab. Again, there's not necessarily a formal association, but interests are certainly aligned. Ansar could provide a pool of recruits for the group, and there is evidence of links between Bongwe in Nakunda and those in Lamu's Boni Forest, the Jai Shaiman. Al-Shabaab propaganda has also historically directly referenced Rimo's teachings. However, primarily Ansar in Kwale are driven by local factors, and that is a key finding, in that we found that those who maybe have traveled to Somalia wouldn't necessarily believe themselves to be joining an internationalist jihadist organization. They felt that they were traveling to gain the skills to defend themselves against local threats, which is much the narrative that Abu Rogo suggested to Kenyan coastal Kenyans.
Christopher, you have like 30 seconds.
Thank you. To conclude, we argue that through understanding Ansar al Sunna, we can better appreciate the nuanced and varied local motivations behind violent Islamist activity on the South Coast and in other parts of Kenya. And there's three key takeaways. So firstly, Sheikh Rimo's ability himself as an individual to connect local grievances with national political processes and global jihadist ideas is critical to understanding violence in Kwale today. Secondly, the use of labels. Labels help us to understand issues, but they also distort or oversimplify our interpretation of local dynamics. We found examples of individuals who could arguably be labeled as Shabab, Ansar al Sunna, or MRC, depending on context, depending on time. So this misinterpretation of the threat leads to a disproportionate response, arguably, and ultimately may reinforce community grievances. And thirdly, and finally, the police relationship is still a major problem across Kwale. We've seen several shootings in the last few months, many of you will have seen, and the securitization of the problem and the cycle of violence reinforces a moral ecology in which the sort of activity that we've seen is considered more acceptable. And the legitimate grievances of those groups, the grievances, the sort of civic grievances which Professor Makimako highlighted are ultimately lost. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Christopher. And Hawa, can I invite you to provide your reflections on the paper?
So first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to comment about this report on Ansar al Sunna, trajectories of violent extremism in Kwale County. This study focused on violence that is taking place within Kenyan borders, and to be specific in Kwale County, and as opposed to across the border. And then it also uses this framework of ABC model, ABC model that links structural factors to individual incentives and enabling factors in its effort to explain violence perpetrated by some members of the group. So I'll give a few comments. I'll start with a few comments on Ansar al Sunna and violence. So hearing Professor Makimako talking and Christopher as well, my first point would be, I mean, it's, okay, there's this disclaimer that Ansar al Sunna or Salafism in general is not I mean, not all members who have engaged in violence are members of this group. So the question that comes to my mind is, why should we focus and say boldly that it is Ansar al Sunna? And why don't we focus on individuals and their motivations to engage in violence, and therefore use participation in violence as the starting point? So in this line of thought, I think I'll give some examples that are in the report. you say that 2 murders took place in Mabokoni, and then you say the circumstances around these murders are illustrative of how Ansar al Sunna violence is currently carried out. I think this is a very bold statement, and reading the report, I did not see much evidence to support it. How do we know whether it is Ansar al Sunna or simply criminals perpetrating this violence? Or is it enough to judge or call something an Ansar al Sunna by virtue of it having been mentioned, the group having been mentioned by an individual? And then these 2 groups, Ansar Sugo, which is claimed to be the violent arm of Ansar al Sunna. So it is said again in the report, it is elements of the Ansar Sugo who are mostly involved in violence. Again, in the report, I did not find really strong evidence to support this. I would be skeptic on that note on labels that are developed by community members, because we know this context very well. There is contention on the one hand between security apparatus. On the one hand, there's the community. On the other hand, we have groups, different kinds of different groups, violent, non-violent. And therefore, this labeling sometimes they serve purposes. We know that some clergy have been using these labels to discredit others. And therefore, I think, it's good that we have, such things are coming out, because this area is really under researched. At the same time, we need to be, have more evidence in such terminologies. And then it is also mentioned that those confident in the teachings have evidently become bolder and more willing to use violence. But that is not to say all adherents to Ansar al Sunna support its use. I think Professor Mokimako has even repeated this already. It was his first statement. But I find it confusing, because it is boldly in the report and also in your talk. In the talk, it's a bit more clearer that it's really not Ansar al Sunna. So my, cross-cutting question is, why do we need the term Ansar al Sunna if we agree that it is not every member of this group that has participated in violence? And then I have several evidence, several statements to illustrate the same point. For example, that these members of this group are seeking to reform. I don't know what they're trying to reform from. And therefore, I'd like to understand more. If this is the case, then if Ansar al Sunna is the problem, what would explain the variation of behavior between these 2 clergy? On the one hand, Sheikh Rimo, who was active in the 1980s, compared to Sheikh Abu Drogo, who came, who was quite outspoken from the 2000s. And of course, if you compare the extent of violence during Abu Drogo's time, there was violence, really violence on the street and riots. So I'd like to understand this, what explains this difference. So the other question I'd like to pose is, who are Ansari? And I'd like to learn from Professor Mokimako, because he's quite knowledgeable in terms of Islamic studies. Ansar al Sunna, the last time I checked, they're called, it's from the word Nusra, I think. Nusra is to rescue, sort of, my layman understanding. It is to rescue. So it is associated with the Prophet when he moved from Mecca to Medina, and the people welcomed him, and therefore they rescued, sort of, in this context, then the thing came up. And therefore, I'd like to understand more if it's really a violent group or it is a religious, concept. So, and then you mentioned about secrecy. Secrecy in terms of their marriage to close family members and network and expanding. So I think sociologically talking, this is not strange. A sociologist would say this is really not strange, that closed groups kind of have close relationships in group, relationships. So for me, there's nothing strange there. I'm not a sociologist, but I think a sociologist would not find that strange at all. Okay, I think, I mean, also it's mentioned that it's kind of a clandestine group from what I get, and it was not easy to establish who the emir is, even if there were some information that there could be an emir or a leader. And I'm wondering is it really hidden? Because I've been to Kunda, and I think the mosques that are associated with the Ansar are actually not to be found. You can see them. Masjid Nur is there. Someone can take you there. It's there, and actually I think I've seen one Ansar, or at least purported Ansar al Sunna clergy. So I don't think they are hiding themselves. So my fear is, I think I understood what you're trying to do, which is really great, document violent activities in Kwale. But the thing is, when you read the report, it brings this idea that Ansar al Sunna is really a criminal clandestine group, which I would have a bit of reservations about. So in this case, so we have to decide now. Is Salafism or Ansar the problem? And if this is the case, because this is an issue that has been that is a continuing debate actually globally, then we should decide, provide evidence, and state it explicitly, and say that Salafism is a problem. It causes violence. And if not, then I think we should not problematize the root causes, but talk about violence as a process. I think this is exactly the point of what, if I understood you well, this is what you are doing. You're looking at violence, as a process, marginalization and all this, police violence and all these things is what you're trying to do. But I mean, I'm just one reader, so other readers might find it differently, but I think I got this impression. And then I would say that, fine, I'm not trying to say that Ansar al Sunna is really, if you talk in terms of peace and conflict, I would say that Rimo was more of a divisionary figure, a purist. And then compared to Abu Drogo and his counterparts, I would say he's a propagator of violence, Islamist violence. So I think, I mean, if we want to problematize what Salafis do in terms of democracy and freedom of expression, that is much welcome, I think, but it would be unfair to try and push this idea of violence if actually we don't have. And after all, from 15 interviews, I think Professor Makumaku will highlight more on the method, but for me, from 15 interviews, I think it is really minimal. And therefore, I would suggest that maybe you consider changing the heading by removing the Ansar al Sunna, unless you want to add more evidence, and say it is trajectories of violence in Kwale County. Okay, and then I missed something in the report. I'm about to finish. These are now very minor points. On the returnees, I think the report highlights, the monotony in the media and the general discourse that, returnees, Al-Shabaab are always the guilty one whenever people talk about violence. And it's a good thing that you're bringing a different perspective. But I think it's also part of the equation, which I think you mentioned it quite at the end when it comes to the relationship with other organizations. But the returnee component, I think, is also fundamental if we have to understand violence in this area. And also, I think you could have benefited more from interviews from law enforcers, because they handle criminal groups and criminal activities in the area. So documentation of this, you could have benefited from, information from police officers. I know that it's not really easy, but I'm sure there's a possibility. And maybe elders who are not clergy, who understand security dynamics, and also someone from Ansar al Sunna itself to give their perspective. The next point is on the issue of labels: extremists, ideology, deeply conservative, violent extremism. I would use this in quotes myself, but I'm just giving my humble point. Yeah, and then the MRC is also mentioned as political versus violent Islamist radicalism as apolitical. I would want to hear more why this distinction is there. Why is one political, one is apolitical? For me, I would say all of them are political. It's politics. Yeah. And then you mentioned about a new Muslim organizations besides IPK. I mean, when multipartyism, you know, entered the scene in Kenya in the 1990s, there were new Muslim organizations that entered the stage. Maybe people know more about IPK, and therefore your report might, you know, add this perspective where you mentioned some of these groups. Which other ones were there? Because it's hard to find this kind of information. And then I don't know. I mean, what evidence supports also that Rimo asked his members to join IPK? I don't know. I've never seen this, and I know this is really something that has been underwritten about. But there's also this idea that Rogo, who was an active member of IPK back then, and Sheikh Balala, who was the leader of IPK back then, they went to see Rogo, and not sure what they were trying to get from him, but it is from Sheikh Abdul Aziz Rimo, and he chased them. So I don't know this linkage between Sheikh Aziz Rimo and IPK. I'm not sure. Maybe you can clarify. And then the last point, or maybe the last one already, this goes to Professor Makimaku. I mean, this is a very contentious issue, and I do not know what impact it has on you as a person from this region, having, you know, studied it, and you have now information, you live in this milieu. Should we be concerned about your safety? Yeah, that's it then from my part. Thank you for this opportunity again.
Thank you so much, Hawa. Excellent feedback. And I think this is a different style of format that we followed for this seminar. And I think it's because there's so much that is unexplored about the coast. And it's not very clear as to where the boundaries lie between extremism versus Islamist groups, Salafist groups, and MRC, what is political, what is not so political. So I would like to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So, you know, you've already given us our feedback, Hawa, so I will sort of pose some of the new questions that are coming from the audience. So the first question, I think I'd like to pose it to Professor Makimako, who actually was quite active in responding to some of the audience's questions, which were quite a few. But some of the ones which I think you could probably also answer. So is the one on asked by Hassan about the local motivations. Apart from local motivations, what could be the foreign impetus driving the emergence of Ansar? And also, if you can maybe talk about what capacity does the group have in terms of directing violence to the state? Yes, so if you can answer these two questions, and I'll move to Christopher.
Well, thank you very much, Hawa. That was quite a good response, I can say. And because there is a lot that Hawa has raised, and I don't think if I'll be able to address every particular point. So let me begin with what you have asked, Gayatri, and then see whether I can have time to respond to Hawa's. Now, about a foreign impetus of Ansar al Sunna, I think we can only link Ansar al Sunna with a foreign impetus based on our own ideological, intellectual interpretations. Because it is a Salafist group, then we want to analyze it in what we perceive as the characteristics of Salafi groups. So at that level of interpretation, we can bring in the foreign element. But in terms of actual participation of foreign individuals in Ansar al Sunna, I cannot provide any concrete evidence that there is a foreign involvement in Ansar al Sunna in its local context, because it is very common, for example, to see that an organization like this would have some of its institutions supported by a foreign donor, for example. But if you look around the mosques and institutions associated with Ansar al Sunna in Kwale, most of these are built by local individuals. So that connection with a foreign donor, for example, if that is what you're looking for, it doesn't appear very visible in reference to the Ansar al Sunna. Now, if I go to Hawa, you know, as
maybe if you just answer one part. There's a lot that she's asked, so maybe one question, and then we can go, because we only have 6-8 minutes left.
Yes, you know, how it is actually very, very difficult to conduct research on Ansar al Sunna in Kwale, particularly so because they have been associated with violence. Even in the local context, they've been associated with violence. So the moment you approach anybody and you want to ask about Ansar al Sunna, the first impression that the person you are approaching would be, you are probably a police officer or an intelligence officer or someone who wants to send a report to the police. Now, it takes a lot of time to convince people that this is actually for academic purposes. And this requires skills that you are not taught in class. It requires interpersonal skills with knowing individuals, gradually gaining their confidence. And personally, as somebody who has done research in this area for almost like 2 decades, I think I have gained that kind of a goodwill within the community to be able to ask people academic questions and have engagements with them on intellectual issues, and for them to respond truthfully without the fear that this information will be sent to any security agencies, you know. So I think it is not based on a book methodology. Rather, it is based on knowing the field and knowing the characters that you want to interview and gaining that confidence with them. Because some of the issues that I was able to discuss with these people, they actually involve individuals who have been involved in violent activities. And if they gain the confidence in you and tell you, well, look, you know, this particular incident, this is the story about this particular incident. And you don't get that from just one person, you get it from 4 or 5 people that you have interviewed. Then you know that the information that you're getting has a degree of credibility. And you have the confidence to include that information in a report. Okay. So that is what happened. Particularly the incident at Mabokoni, while to a casual observer it might look like this is just criminality, but there are certain details that people explain to you that actually tell you it is not only criminality, but it is criminality that has a religious ideology in it. And maybe when you and I meet, I'll be able to give you the details of what kind of information is there that links it to a religious ideology. Yeah, I think that will be my response on that. The Ansar, the Ansar, of course, they are in 2 groups. If you go to Kunda, they'll tell you they're in 2 groups. They are Ansar Sugu, and since you speak Swahili, you know what the meaning of Sugu is, the hardened ones. You know, and then there are the Ansar Zabwanya. Zabwanya is something that is loosely formed, you know, and for them, they attach a certain meaning to these categorizations. And these are not categorizations made by by myself. These are categorizations that are discussed even in Ukunda. They tell you that this person, these are Ansar Sugu, you know, and Sugu basically means the hardened ones, you know, and Zabwanya. And so to interpret it, basically it means that within the Ansar group, there are those who are not inclined to violence, and there are those who can be inclined to violence. But the question now is, how did they turn? You know, because as we explained, basically Abu Drog, Aziz Rimo, he never advocated violence, meaning physical violence. Maybe he had verbal violence, but physical violence, no, because his teachings were very strict. And as a result of his teaching, there were cases where people would engage in physical fights, including members of the same family, you know. But he never, for example, teach his followers that they need to take up arms and fight state institutions.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Makimako. I'm just sorry, I'll have to cut you off there because we only have 3 minutes, and I want to include one question to Christopher as well, because there are 2 questions now. So Christopher, quite quickly then, could you help us understand how Ansar is like funded? And also if there are any linkages with other international terror groups such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, apart from Al-Shabaab?
Thank you, Gayatri. And thank you, Hawa, for your detailed feedback. So I'll struggle with the first question, to be honest, and I think anyone would with the financing question. We're talking about a religious group based on ideology. That it's where the actual there's no financing needed perhaps for operations, because there aren't, we're not talking about a group that has military operations or anything. So there's not really funding needed in that regard. It's a religious entity. So where that funding comes from, Hassan might have a little bit more to say. But I would like to comment on, particularly on the question on international links. I think we're slowly building up this sort of more broader understanding of the sort of flow of information, the flow of ideas across the East African coast. And I think particularly people are asking about potential links with Mozambique and what's happening in Cabo Delgado. I think the interesting thing is here that so Rogo from Mombasa and we've seen, albeit there's been a little bit of disagreement there, but we've seen how Rogo's ideas, Rimo's ideas, perhaps there's some crossover and linkage in Kwale. And Rogo's followers, ultimately, many ended up in Tanzania in the last sort of 10, 15 years. And there was a lot of violence in 2015, 2016 in the Pwani, Kibiti within Pwani in Tanzania. And then the idea is that a lot of those guys ended up perhaps crossing over the border into Cabo Delgado and are now active in northern Mozambique. That is broadly a hypothesis, but it has sort of been supported by sort of several rumors on the whole, independent rumors. That network along the Kenyan coast, of the Swahili-speaking coast, is much stronger, I think, than we realized at one point. So I think there's undoubtedly links in terms of the flows, both the flows of information and potentially the physical movement of people south from Kwale into Cabo Delgado. And finally, my last point is on there were some questions about Jaish Ayman and any links there. As Hassan said in the comments, a lot of those guys are Kenyan recruits from Nairobi and from Majengo, but there's also a suggestion that, say, Ramadan Kafungwa, who is from Bongwe himself and is active in the Boni Forest, that he and his network has been particularly active in Kwale. So there are definitely connections. But I think what we've been trying to say with this paper is try and take this sort of very localized, effectively, Islamist Salafist organization and explain how that sort of root of ideas perhaps is linked, inconsistently and sort of diffusely across a range of organizations and a range of groups in Kenya and East Africa. Thank you, Gayatri.
Great, thank you so much. I'm afraid we will have to end here because it is time. Hawa, I would like to begin with you by thanking you for your discussion points. And I'm sorry we can't give you more time, but I think the points that you make is very relevant. And I think what is quite critical is that when we're interpreting contexts such as the South Coast, we really need to be aware about how we're talking about violence and what is interrogatory lens that we want to adopt. Professor Makimako, as usual, incredible comments, and thank you so much for your work on this paper and for bringing to light the very complex relationship between Al Sunna and Ansari and Al-Shabaab. Christopher, thank you as well for your incisive comments and your work on this paper. Thank you all for the participants for this very lively discussion. I'm sorry we have to cut it short at this moment, but we hope that you will read this paper when it does come out, which it will be soon, and we will keep you updated on that. Thank you again. Take care.